Look at the physical evidence of your own psychic fragmentation. Observe the neglected corner of your dwelling, the guitar case gathering dust, the half-finished manuscript, the specialized coding manual resting beside a set of tools for masonry. These are not merely abandoned hobbies. They are the tombstones of unlived potentials. They represent energy invested, then violently withdrawn. Your conscious mind, the ego, offers a comfortable rationalization. It whispers that you are simply suffering from a lack of grit, or perhaps a temporary deficit of time. You promise yourself that tomorrow, or next month, you will finally commit to one path, achieving the coveted focus the world demands. This self-deception is the first layer of the neurosis. But you are not merely tired. You are experiencing acute psychic dissociation. The feeling of being scattered is the precise acoustic signature of your soul fracturing. You are not failing to choose. You are currently possessed by a powerful, multifaceted complex that demands simultaneous mastery of every domain it touches. It is the shadow asserting control through demanding too much, ensuring that the necessary commitment to one thing at a time becomes psychologically impossible. The world has conditioned you to fear this condition, labeling it dilettantism. The collective neurosis insists that value is found only in depth, the single deep tunnel dug by the specialist. This is the path of the persona, the mask that promises security through rigid, predictable competence. For a century, this model was rewarded. It was the game played in a kind environment where the rules were static, predictable, and measurable, like the trajectory of a clockwork mechanism. If you applied 10,000 hours to one narrow discipline, the outcome was guaranteed. But your deeper intelligence, the unconscious, knows we no longer inhabit that world. We exist in a wicked environment where the rules shift daily, where technologies collapse overnight, and where the specialist is inherently fragile. If the narrow pillar supporting his life is removed, he is left suspended in the void. Your apparent chaos is, in fact, an instinctive survival mechanism, attempting to build redundancy against this very collapse. You are not chaotic. You are strategically adaptive. The shame you feel, the sense of being an imposter, is the judgment of the collective ego projected onto your adaptive intelligence. You are told you lack the discipline to stay in one lane. This is the language of the herd, which fears any deviation from its established path. But the true value of the individual is not found in conforming to the geometry of the collective. It is found in the synthesis of disparate worlds. While the specialist practices near transfer, applying known solutions to familiar problems, you engage in far transfer. You take the symbolic structure of one completely unrelated field, perhaps the growth cycles observed in agriculture, or the structural integrity required in architecture, and you apply it to the abstract domain of modern data systems or financial modeling. This is not dabbling. It is the bridging of archetypal domains. You are building connections between worlds that the single-pillar specialist cannot even perceive. You are functioning as the architect of ruins, understanding how systems collapse and how new ones must be constructed from the wreckage of the old. Your value is not in depth alone, but in the lateral movement, the capacity for synthesis. However, recognizing this psychological truth does not immediately dissipate the exhaustion, the burnout, or the crushing sense of being perpetually behind. The anxiety persists because you are failing to grasp the fundamental geometry of your own potential. You are not intended to be T-shaped, broad knowledge with a single, deep specialization. You are M-shaped, multiple pillars of depth connected by a dynamic bridge of relentless curiosity. The failure, the reason for the graveyard of projects, lies in the attempt to construct all these pillars simultaneously. To try to master data science, write a novel, and launch a business in the same season is to invite collapse. It is a psychological impossibility, leading only to further dissociation and the strengthening of the complex that demands everything and receives nothing. The path toward individuation, for the M-shaped psyche, is serial mastery. You must view your life as a sequence of seasons, not as a monolithic structure to be built all at once. You must allow the unconscious process to dictate the necessary focus for a defined period. Perhaps your 20s were dedicated entirely to the exploration of the arts and symbolic language. That season is not a failure simply because you pivot in your 30s to programming or engineering to secure the necessary material foundation. You did not quit the art. You simply concluded that phase of construction. This requires the psychological fortitude to deny the immediate demands of the collective. You must protect your psychic energy from the high-demand roles that seek to consume your entire working life, leaving no space for the other pillars of the self to develop. One pillar must be the foundation, the necessary compromise with the world, perhaps paying the bills, while the others are cultivated sequentially, often in the quiet hours of the night. The true strength of this approach lies in its evolutionary redundancy. Redundancy is not waste. It is the ultimate measure of biological resilience. If you are only a specialist engineer, and technological acceleration renders your skill obsolete, you face existential terror. But if you are an engineer who also possesses the skills of a mechanic, a teacher, and a philosopher, you become psychically unbreakable. The economic environment can shift, the collective can panic, but you retain the capacity for pivot. You have built a safety net of integrated skills that ensures survival, regardless of the fate of any single industry. Stop apologizing for the scattered nature of your interests. Those were not failures. They were semesters in the necessary adaptive university of the self. You were never meant to be a single, static entity. You were built to be the bridge itself, the synthesis point between worlds that the specialized mind cannot even conceive. This is the necessary neurosis of the modern polymath, and the first step to integration is the recognition that the sickness is, in fact, the cure. We must now move beyond the external observation of behavior, the mere cataloging of abandoned projects, and descend into the anatomy of the psyche. The shame that accompanies the self-designation of dilettante is not a moral failing. It is the friction generated when the innate geometry of the self clashes violently with the rigid expectations of the collective. This conflict is the essence of modern neurosis. The world demands a persona, a mask of functional simplicity. It requires you to define yourself with a single marketable title: engineer, attorney, specialist. This persona is designed for social navigation and economic efficiency, promising security through clarity. Yet, the individual who possesses this deep M-shaped cognitive architecture finds the persona suffocating. The moment they commit to the single deep hole, the mile deep specialization, the unconscious recoils. The abandoned project, the half-finished code, the guitar gathering dust in the corner, is not evidence of a lack of grit. It is a necessary, if painful, act of psychological self-preservation. It is the ego, driven by a deeper instinctual wisdom, sabotaging the very structure that threatens to contain it. The psyche refuses to be crystallized into a static form. Completion, in this context, feels like death, the premature burial of potential. The specialist is content with near transfer. They solve new problems using old, familiar tools. Their ego finds comfort in repetition. But the M-shaped individual, the polymath in formation, is driven by the mandate of far transfers. Their entire psychological system requires the synthesis of disparate domains. The fascination with electrical wiring one year, and ancient philosophy the next, is the unconscious mind gathering data points, not for depth, but for the bridge-building capacity. This instinct is so powerful that it will shatter the persona, rather than permit the containment of a single identity. We are, therefore, observing the work of the architect of ruins. The individual starts building a structure, only to tear it down when the foundation threatens to become a prison. The neurosis is the result of the ego's failure to understand this process. The ego attempts to judge the cyclical destruction through the lens of the collective, leading to the crushing feeling of being an imposter. You feel like a fraud because you are measuring your complex adaptive reality against the simple specialist persona. This feeling of being perpetually behind the master of one, the individual who has secured the senior vice president title by 30, is a projection. You are watching someone who successfully traded breadth for immediate, finite reward. But in a wicked environment, where the rules of the game are constantly shifting, the specialist is highly fragile. Their structure is optimized for one specific pressure point. If that pressure point shifts, the structure collapses entirely. Your scattered interests, which you judge as weakness, are in fact your evolutionary insurance policy. They are the redundancy mechanisms built into your psychic framework. They are the shadow aspects of your potential that refuse to be integrated into a single simplistic persona. The healing begins when you cease the self-flagellation, the signal degradation, and recognize that the function of these cycles is to maintain the adaptive readiness of the self. The true conflict is not between starting and finishing. It is between the ego's desire for social approval and the self's demand for unceasing motion and integration. The cure for the polymath's neurosis is not commitment to a single task, but the conscious structural acceptance of serial mastery. This process demands that you stop viewing the abandoned art project as a failure and start viewing it as a completed semester, a necessary data acquisition phase that prepared the ground for the next, entirely different phase of construction. You are not meant to be a monolithic tower. You are meant to be a complex, self-repairing ecosystem. The neurosis of the modern polymath stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of psychic geometry. We must move beyond the simplistic architecture of the T-shaped individual, a rigid structure optimized for a single economic function. That is the architecture of the persona, designed for immediate utility and superficial recognition. Your psyche, however, demands the complexity of the M form, multiple pillars of mastery, each representing a fully integrated complex, connected by the fluid medium of the self's perpetual curiosity. This connectivity is the mechanism of far transfer, the capacity to extract the essence of a principle from one domain and apply it to an unrelated field. Consider the individual who moves from the practice of beekeeping to the creation of complex software systems. He is not merely applying tools, he is translating the archetype of the organic growth cycle and the management of a self-regulating colony into the language of computation. The specialist coder sees only syntax. The polymath sees the cultivation of an ecosystem. This synthesis, this bridging of worlds that the specialist cannot even perceive, is where true innovation resides. The value of the M form is not in its depth, but in the catalytic energy generated at the intersections of its varying competencies. Yet the ego, driven by greed and the anxiety of time, attempts to construct all pillars simultaneously. This is the surest path to psychic collapse. You cannot sustain 3 distinct deep dives into data science, novel writing, and entrepreneurial venture within the same orbital period. The libido, the finite engine of psychic life, is dispersed too thinly, resulting in burnout and the perception of being perpetually behind. The true polymath understands the necessity of serial mastery. Life is not a monolithic structure built instantly. It is an alchemical sequence of distinct processes. We must learn to view these abandoned projects, the half-finished canvas, the coded prototype, the forgotten language, not as monuments to failure, but as completed seasons of the soul. The psychic material required from that domain has been assimilated. The lesson is absorbed, and the self, ever moving, demands a shift in focus. The tragedy is when the individual attempts to force integration prematurely, sacrificing internal necessity for external validation. The mature individual, recognizing the finite nature of his energy, consciously denies the high-demand, high-status positions that would consume the remaining space required for the other, vital pillars of his existence. He protects his time, his sacred circumference, not as a boundary against work, but as a defense mechanism against the annihilation of his inner life. He allows the pillar that pays the bills to exist as a functional utility, while the pillars of music, philosophy, and design flourish in the protected hours of the night. He does not try to merge them until they are ready, letting them exist sequentially, building strength in isolation before the final, spontaneous synthesis. The final, most profound insight into this adaptive chaos lies in evolutionary biology, translated into the language of the psyche: redundancy. In the realm of the physical, redundancy ensures survival against catastrophic failure, the elephant's massive genetic defense against cellular anarchy. Psychologically, your diverse, seemingly irrelevant competencies are your genetic backup. The specialist has placed all of his psychic capital into a single vault. If the market for that specialization collapses, the individual is rendered existentially obsolete. But if the primary persona, the specialist engineer, is rendered obsolete by technological shift, the individual is not destroyed. The shadow, which held the capacity for electrical repair, teaching languages, or architectural design, steps forward. These capacities, previously judged as mere hobbies or dabbling, become the emergency infrastructure. You have not been wasting your time. You have been engaging in strategic adaptability, ensuring that no singular catastrophe can dismantle the totality of your functional self. This is the ultimate defense against the wicked environment. The graveyard of half-finished projects is not a testament to a lack of grit, but evidence of an aggressive, adaptive intelligence that refuses to be contained by a single definition. You were never meant to be a monolithic tower of singular purpose. You were built to be the bridge, connecting disparate realities, ensuring that the self remains robust and adaptable, even as the world burns down the rigid structures of the past. Cease the apology, embrace the complexity. The neurosis ends when the ego finally bows to the wisdom of the self's chaotic movement. The necessity of redundancy is a sound biological principle, yet we must exercise extreme caution when translating adaptive chaos into psychological freedom. For many, the graveyard of abandoned pursuits is not a sign of strategic genius. It is the visible symptom of a profound internal fragmentation. The individual is not the master of their own curiosity, but a vessel possessed by a rotating cast of autonomous complexes. The complex is fundamentally a splinted piece of the psyche, divorced from the central ego consciousness, yet demanding energy as if it were the self. When we observe the man who cycles through high-intensity hobbies, the 6 months of obsession with beekeeping followed by the sudden, brutal rejection in favor of theoretical physics, we are not witnessing adaptability. We are witnessing possession. The ego is momentarily hijacked by an internal tyrant demanding a specific chemical or intellectual signature, only to relinquish control when the initial rush subsides. The shame that follows, the distinct feeling of being a fraud, is the ego's recognition of its own powerlessness. It knows it did not choose the abandonment. The complex chose it. The complex operates on the principle of the eternal beginning. It promises the thrill of initiation, the pure potentiality of the new field, but it violently recoils from the necessary descent into mastery, which requires sacrifice and limitation. This mechanism finds its clearest articulation in the archetype of the puer aeternus, the eternal youth. The puer, terrified of being bound by a single identity, mistakes limitation for death. He must perpetually maintain the illusion of infinite choice. Therefore, he starts the guitar, the coding project, the philosophical treatise, but he never completes the required descent into the dark earth of specialized labor. To finish the thing is to commit to a boundary, and commitment means the death of all other possibilities. This is the central difference between the adaptive M-shaped mind and the neurotic dilettante. The polymath executes serial mastery, completing the season of construction before moving to the next pillar. The puer engages in serial flight, abandoning each project just before the effort becomes real, thereby ensuring that his potential remains theoretically perfect, but practically null. He is not building a bridge between worlds. He is building an architect of ruins, whose sole function is to ensure that no structure stands long enough to demand maturity. We must ask ourselves, when the urge strikes to abandon the half-finished website and immediately purchase the deep-sea diving equipment, who is demanding this? Is it the wisdom of the self-seeking necessary redundancy? Or is it a specific complex? Perhaps the father complex demanding recognition through novelty, or the shadow demanding avoidance of confrontation with competence. If you find yourself perpetually cycling, not building pillars but scattering dust, you are not adapting. You are being drained. Each abandoned project represents psychic energy invested and then violently withdrawn, leaving the ego exhausted, prone to projection, and convinced of its own inadequacy. The neurosis is not the diversity of interests. The neurosis is the compulsive necessity of the switch. To integrate these fragments requires the ego to stand against the autonomous will of the complex. The individual must choose a pillar, not because they are inherently passionate about it, but because the complex demands they abandon it. The work is not in the coding or the music. The work is in the stubborn refusal to surrender the energy to the internal tyrant. This act of conscious commitment is the sacrificial fire that transforms the scattered dust of potentiality into the solid architecture of the self. Without this sacrifice, the individual remains merely a haunted house, occupied temporarily by whatever internal demon is currently strongest. The psychological diagnosis of the scattered life often misidentifies the symptom. It is not the breadth of activity that constitutes the sickness. It is the compulsion toward abandonment. We have established that the adaptive mind builds pillars through serial mastery, accepting the limitation inherent in seasonal construction. But the neurotic soul, captivated by the archetype of the puer aeternus, cannot tolerate limitation. For the poor, commitment is the psychic equivalent of death, because to choose one path means sacrificing the infinite possibility of all others. He clings desperately to the illusion that his potential remains perfect and undiminished, precisely because it has never been tested against the harsh reality of execution. This resistance to definition is the root of the neurosis. The individual is not merely moving from guitar to coding to jujitsu. He is fleeing the moment where the work ceases to be theoretical and begins to demand the integration of the despised shadow, the dull, rigorous, and persistent quality of the specialist. The puer despises the specialist because the specialist has accepted the finite nature of his own existence and has chosen to dig one hole deep, thereby rejecting the glorious, shimmering surface of everything else. The individual caught in this cycle is not generating redundancy. He is generating signal degradation. Each project is started with the full charge of psychic energy, only to be violently withdrawn when the initial chemical euphoria of novelty dissipates. This withdrawal leaves behind a residue of toxic shame and a growing conviction of inadequacy. The ego becomes an architect of ruins, whose only functioning structure is the inner museum of failure, perpetually reminding the host that he is the one who could have been, but never is. We must understand the biological economy at play here. The complex, once established, operates autonomously. Your biology demands the chemical signature of novelty, much like a predator requires blood for sustenance. The moment the initial obstacle appears, the challenging algorithm, the tedious scale practice, the painful muscle soreness, the internal tyrant, the complex, whispers the ancient lie. This is not who you are. The real work lies in the next field. And the ego, exhausted by its own lack of structure, submits, chasing the next hit of potentiality. To break this cycle demands not mere discipline, but a profound act of psychological sacrifice. The individual must intentionally choose a pillar, not because it feels uniquely passionate, but specifically because the complex demands its abandonment. You must stand in the fire of the mundane. The work is not in the external activity. It is in the stubborn, conscious refusal to surrender the energy to the internal tyrant. This is the moment of confrontation between the ego and the autonomous will of the complex. This commitment is the sacrificial fire that transforms scattered dust into the solid architecture of the self. You must sacrifice the image of the perpetually free, unfettered child. You must burn the bridge back to theoretical perfection. The pain of this sacrifice is the only currency accepted by the unconscious for the construction of a mature personality. The neurosis can only be cured when the ego is willing to suffer the boredom and the limitation that the pure so desperately avoids. The true M-shaped structure is not merely a collection of skills on a resume. It is the geometric necessity of the integrated psyche. The pillars are not just professions. They are integrated aspects of the self, the capacity for the methodical scholar, the emotional depth of the artist, the strategic planning of the warrior. The bridge connecting these pillars is the conscious acceptance of paradox, the capacity to hold the tension between these opposing forces without collapsing into chaos. If the individual refuses this confrontation, refusing to anchor themselves in the world through defined acts of commitment, they remain merely a haunted vessel, occupied temporarily by whatever fleeting complex is currently strongest. They are not adapting, they are drifting. The ultimate confrontation is not with the job market or the economy. It is with the imago Dei, the image of the self that the individual is failing to actualize. The universe does not reward potential. It demands manifestation. Fail to manifest and you regress, becoming merely the echo distant of what you might have been. The price of non-commitment is the slow, agonizing signal degradation of the soul. This is the hard truth of individuation. You must choose to suffer the limitation of being this person, rather than remaining the theoretical possibility of every person. It is in the acceptance of limitation that true freedom is found, for only the defined structure can hold the weight of consciousness. We have established that the M-shaped structure is an evolutionary necessity, a shield against the psychic fragility of the specialist. But the structure itself is inert, unless it is animated by conscious intention. The true challenge of the polymath is not the acquisition of skills. That is merely the surface work. It is the integration of the internal personalities that govern those skills. The man who codes and the man who composes music are often engaged in a civil war within the psyche. The methodical, time-bound engineer clashes violently with the chaotic, timeless artist. This tension, if left unresolved, results in the very collapse and burnout you fear. The bridge connecting the pillars of your M is not built of time management strategies. It is forged from the deliberate confrontation with the shadow. Each abandoned project, each half-finished pursuit, holds a fragment of the psychic energy you withdrew when you encountered fundamental resistance. You did not fail the skill. You failed the confrontation with the limitation it imposed. You ran from the necessary suffering. The world insists on immediate, linear progress, but the process of individuation is profoundly circular. It is a slow, difficult circumambulatio around the center, the self. Serial mastery is the conscious application of psychic energy in seasons. When you dedicate 3 years to learning the rigorous structure of musical composition, you are not merely learning scales. You are integrating the archetype of the harmonizer. When you pivot entirely to the cold logic of market analysis, you are integrating the archetype of the strategist. You are not discarding the old self. You are extracting the essential psychic gold from that experience and carrying it forward into the next domain. This process demands the toleration of apparent regression. When you shift from a high-status, deep engineering role back to the foundational work of a new skill, the ego suffers a profound injury. It feels the sting of incompetence, the shame of starting over. This suffering is not accidental, it is essential. It prevents the ego from inflating and reminds it that it is merely the servant of the totality of the psyche. The goal of this life geometry is not to be the best in the world at any singular thing. The goal is to be fully, uncompromisingly you. The neurosis of the modern polymath stems ultimately from the refusal to view their life as a religious text, a narrative dictated by the unconscious. You are the architect of ruins, constantly dismantling old structures to build new, more complex ones. But the ultimate blueprint is held by the self, the unifying center. Your chaotic interests are the breadcrumbs left by the unconscious, guiding you toward the unique configuration that only you can manifest. You refuse to pick up those breadcrumbs. If you insist on fitting the collective mold of the specialist, you are sacrificing your own internal divinity for the safety of collective approval. This is the ultimate betrayal. The price of this betrayal is the slow, agonizing erosion of meaning, the quiet terror of waking up one day realizing that you have traded the overwhelming richness of existence for the predictable sterility of a narrow path. The path of the M-shaped individual is difficult precisely because it is unique. It demands a high degree of consciousness. It demands that you stop apologizing for the terrifying complexity of your own soul and begin treating your life as the sacred experiment it is. Stop searching for external validation of your disparate skills. The validation does not come from the market. It comes only from the feeling of internal necessity, the numinous realization that you are finally performing the work you were intrinsically built to do. The true M-shape is realized when the individual ceases to have multiple careers and begins instead to be the living bridge between them, a place where previously separate worlds collide and create something entirely new. This is not a mere self-help technique. It is a confrontation with destiny. It is the inescapable call to individuation. If you are prepared to cease this endless, debilitating drifting and begin the meticulous, conscious work of constructing the self, if you are ready to integrate the shadow that haunts your abandoned projects and transform mere theoretical potential into manifest reality, then the true journey begins now, anchored in the paradoxical tension of the integrated life.